Hello, and welcome to another APUSH review. This one is on political parties from the very beginning all the way up until our more modern era. So let's go ahead and get right into this. Now don't forget, you can always pause and write some of this stuff down because I'm going to kind of go through this quickly because a lot of this we're pretty familiar with at this point in time. Factions to parties. Well, what do we mean by this? Well, as they're transitioning from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, groups of individuals started to have their various opinions, and that's what a faction is. Groups of individuals who try to influence policy or change one's thinking, but they don't last very long. And in this case, you had the anti-Federalists who didn't really want the Constitution, and then the Federalists who wanted to support it. Later on, when Madison would write in Federalist number 10, he would explain to us how exactly you control a faction. You can't take away its liberty and you can't take away its thinking ability, but you can control how it affects individuals. But eventually factions will lead to the rise of party between Hamilton and Jefferson, the way they view the Constitution, loosely and strictly, and especially over the issue of the bank. The bank is the catalyst for Jefferson and his partner Madison to start the Jeffersonian Republican Party. And of course, then if you have a party, Hamilton felt like, well, I got to have a party too. And next thing you know, they have Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans, and everything's getting all messed up now. Well, Jeffersonian Republicans, basically, this is Jefferson's view of what America should be like, this agrarian nation, yeoman farmers, virtuous farmers all over America growing all sorts of nice things. States' rights, it's very much a states' rights, anti-central government. They're also very pro-French when it came to foreign affairs. And they like lowering tariffs because, hey, that's a states' rights issue. States' rights. Where the Federalists were much more about a strong government, a strong centralized government with a powerful constitution and a president who had a lot of authority. They're pro-British when it comes to foreign affairs. They're also kind of on the elitist side. They do not like what we call democracy. George Washington himself called that mobocracy, and they believe in a strong economy. The Federalists take power with Washington, although Washington himself, remember, never actually joins a party. He does lean on the side of the Federalists. We get the first bank in the United States, Assumption. There's a whiskey rebellion because they're laying taxes on whiskey, and whiskey farmers, Scotch-Irish whiskey farmers in Pennsylvania are like, not my whiskey, and they pick up their guns, and Washington forms a militia, and nobody actually gets shot. But the government is able to show force here that not only are they allowed to tax you, but they're allowed to enforce a tax. That's one of the key elements of the whiskey rebellion, that the government can, in fact, force a tax and on us and then force us to pay it. With Adams, you get XYZ affair, which led to Alien Sedition Acts. And if you remember, that's primarily to try to hurt the Jeffersonian Republican Party, trying to stop immigrants from coming to America and speaking out against the President of the United States, which Jefferson was like, well, yeah, you're going to throw that at me? Well, I'm going to come up with now Kentucky-Virginia resolutions. How do you like that? And I'm going to interpret the Constitution in what I call my compact theory, that the states create the federal government and not the other way around. Boy, these people cannot play nice together anymore, can they? Well, Jefferson eventually wins his own election, the election of 1800. He called it his second revolution. He was bringing it back to the principles of 1776, what he thought was classical liberalism, the idea that government is a social contract between the people, and that the people have more say in that regard. And so you have smaller government and more states' rights issue. Of course, immediately he's well, I won't say immediately, but very shortly into his presidency, he's conflicted over the idea of Louisiana. Is that strict constructionism? Is that loose constructionism? I don't know. I'm just going to go with it. Roll with it, people. I'm doubling the size of America right now. Or as Jefferson would say, I'm doubling the size of America right now, people. So just roll with it. Then later on, all these presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, they all have to deal with the British. They're constantly impressing our sailors and messing with our maritime trade. The French get involved. So Jefferson throws an embargo act out there. we roll into James Madison, another of these Jeffersonian Republicans, and he's got to finally deal with this issue of impressment and the War of 1812. And of course, the British burned down the Capitol building. Yeah, that's not a really good look for America. But then Jeffersonian Republicans, they're going to be strict on everything. So they allowed that first bank's charter to run out in 1811. They could not have predicted the very following year they're going to go to war. Something I haven't said in any of the reviews is another main reason America goes to war are a group of young politicians in Congress who are called war hawks, and they're really pushing for this war. Of course, they start this war without any way to really finance it and raise a military and blah, 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 blah. So at the end of the war, Jeffersonian Republicans kind of have to swallow a little pride here and do a little loosey-goosey and bring back a protective tariff. Well, I won't say bring back, that's the wrong wordage. They bring back a bus, but they established the very first protective tariff in American history, 1816. What about states' rights? Well, states' rights are cool and everything, but we have a new industry in America, textile industry, followed by a lot of other stuff is happening, and the British are trying to crush that. So maybe it's a good thing to have a protective tariff. Of course, by the time James Monroe, they're building canals, they're building roads, but Jeffersonian Republicans, again, they're not really sure if this is constitutional for the government to be involved. So when the Cumberland Road is being built, which would stretch all the way from the Cumberland Gap out of Pennsylvania, all the way across Pennsylvania to Ohio and to Indiana and to Illinois, and it's a pretty long road for its time period, Madison will veto any repairs to that and said that's a states' rights issue. Let's move on. Let's look at what happens to the Jeffersonian Republicans as a political party now. As we talked about factions, the Federalists eventually will shoot themselves in the foot and die as a party because of the War of 1812. They have this little thing they call the Hartford Convention takes place. I'll say that again. Hartford Convention. By the way, did you hear what I just said? Hartford Convention. Here they want to moan and groan and complain about what the government was doing during the War of 1812. And really like a bunch of just complainers. They write a list of grievances. And they don't realize the war is actually over. They don't realize Andrew Jackson has just won the Battle of New Orleans. They decide to come and complain anyways, and they look like a bunch of traitors and a bunch of just crybabies, and it kills their party. Well, with the Federalists basically gone, now you only have Jeffersonian Republicans. Or do you? You actually have two groups. You have Nationalist Republicans, you have Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans feel they're the true heirs of Thomas Jefferson. They're states' writers. They believe in a social contract with the people. They also believe very highly in the spoils system. And Andrew Jackson will become their leader and eventually rename the Republican Party the Democratic Party. The others are the National Republicans. Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, Daniel Webster. These are Republicans, but they believe more in American system. The idea that we'll have roads and canals and internal improvements, and we'll build an observatory, and we'll have state-sponsored schools, and it'll be a great place to finally live. Well, maybe not. See, this is going to be the problem within the problem of this party, and eventually something's going to give way. The Democrats will become just the Democrats, and the National Republicans will become the Whigs. I always like that name, the Whigs. They take it from an old British faction that happened earlier on, prior to the American Revolution, and you gotta love the British and their wit. We're going to call ourselves Whigs because we don't wear wigs. We're the British. Oh, we're so funny. And so here we go. And another thing is to call themselves Whigs is because they make personal attacks on Andrew Jackson, and they say he's kingly-like, and we're going to be the Whigs. Okay, great. And so you see our Democratic presidents now, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and, of course, James K. Polk, the true heir of Andrew Jackson. Now, the Whigs do win 2 elections. They actually won 2 elections, and I have asterisks next to this because both these men were generals, which is awesome, I suppose, and then both these men, unfortunately, no, they die. They die in office. William Henry Harrison, the shortest president term in office ever, decides to give a long-winded speech, 2 hours long, by the way, in the cold and the rain for his inaugural address. Gets a cold. He dies. And then John Tyler, who's really not even a Whig. He's really a Democrat, but he didn't like Andrew Jackson. Now he finds himself to be a Whig president and gets the Whigs really mad at him because he's going to really act like a Democrat, and becomes the only president to be thrown out of his political party is John Tyler. Zachary Taylor wins the election of 48, and you've got a situation here where he too will go out on July 4th, watching parades on a very hot day, drinking cold milk and eating cold strawberries and other assortments of cherries, gets very sick, and then he dies. And then the guy that everyone always forgets, Millard Fillmore, kind of fills in for a while. But again, the big issue between Democrats and Whigs, states' rights versus Henry Clay's American system. Why did Clay never become president? He should have been president. Oh, that Clay. And that's my dog in the background if you can't hear him barking. The birth of the modern Republican Party is going to happen, 1854. Why does this happen? Well, because of slavery. Slavery becomes a big issue, the expansion of it westward. Now, you have to understand something. These Republicans who come together in 1854 and decide to take on this name Republican Party, they're not all a bunch of abolitionists. We have radicals and we have very conservatives. The conservatives of this group, they don't want the expansion of slavery, not because they feel any moralistic feelings, but because it's an economic competition for them. Why should the South have free labor? And we need to stop that at the borders of Texas, basically. The radicals are much more involved in abolition, like William Seward, Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner. Those are the big leaders of the radical movement. Although the majority of them are conservative, the Republicans are made up of a bunch of different parties. Northern Whigs, as they fell apart, they're the main contributors to this new party. Then you also have the Know-Nothings, because they're really the American Party, but if you were to ask them what they're all about, they would tell you they don't know, because, shh, it's a secret. All right, so the Know-Nothings, and another group of people called the Free Soilers, who also believe that after the Mexican-American War, all the land that was acquired, I'm doing air quotes, you cannot see that, air quotes, acquired from Mexico should remain free. The Know-Nothings and the Free Soilers, they're third parties, not very good. But they join up with the Northern Whigs and they form this Republican Party. Of course, this is the party then that prosecutes the war, I should say, the Civil War, and with the Democrats out, and we'll talk about them in a little bit, what happens to them during the Civil War. The radicals and the conservatives work together, and they get a lot of things done during the Civil War. They pass a Legal Tender Act, gets us our first uniform currency, the greenbacks. We get the National Banking Act, allowing certain banks to kind of collude together. Even though we're not going to have one bank like the Bank of the United States and the second bank, we'll have a group of banks that can work together and regulate the economy and extend credit and blah, 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 blah. We get the Pacific Railroad Act passed that allows us to finally build a railroad to allow East to meet West. What else do they wind up doing here? They get the Homestead Act. We encourage a bunch of immigrants to go west and settle the western lands. There's quite a bit that they're able to do during the Civil War, and that not only win the war, and of course their first president is, who is that? Let me see. I know he's tall. He grew a beard. Abe Lincoln. Kind of forget that guy. When the war comes to an end, the radical element eventually vanishes, although not before they get the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment passed. But factions come back. Here come more factions now within the Republican Party. You have the stalwarts and the half-breeds. Remember, the whole issue with these Republicans is party patronage spoil system. Stalwarts love it, love it, love it, love it. They like all the favors. They like being able to control the political machinery. The half-breeds, they're a smaller faction. They don't necessarily want to get rid of it, but they want to reform it. Eventually, we're going to get a president shot over this, James Garfield. And when that happens, his successor, Chester A. Arthur, yes, there's a president named Chester, he becomes the new president. Although he is a stalwart and supposed to love party patronage, he pushes through Congress what's known as a reform bill, the Pendleton Act, or the Civil Service Reform Bill, starting to make some of these federal jobs, instead of just favors, now you have to take kind of an exam to get them. Throughout the Gilded Age and going into the 20th century, Republicans start to go further and further towards laissez-faire economics. allowing big business to flourish, allowing the rise of monopolies, to become very much tied together with our Andrew Carnegies and your Rockefellers and that sort of stuff. And then progressivism comes. And Theodore Roosevelt decides, you know what, I'm a Republican, I like fiscal responsibility, but I can go which way I want to go because I'm Theodore Roosevelt, bully! And decides to embrace some of this progressive ideas, a little bit more liberal thinking, because he wants to help the people. And so some reform will come politically through Theodore Roosevelt. Let's go back and look at the Democrats here real quick. Their rise or fall, the rise again of the Democratic Party. Yes, that is a jackass in the background because Andrew Jackson, people didn't like him. They like to call him Andrew Jackass Jackson. He said, yeah, that's right, I'm owning it. It is now my image of my party. Booyah. So what is going on with the Democrats? Well, they start off as Jefferson's party in this idea of liberty, life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness, but also this idea of property, which is a states' rights issue. Liberty versus property, property versus liberty. What do you think I'm talking about? What do you think I'm talking about? Slavery. Yeah, I knew some of you out there were pretty smart. So slavery really starts to eat at the Democratic Party. Many, if not all of our Southern Democrats are going to be slave-owning, property-owning men. And this is really going to pull at the party. They watch the Whig Party completely fall apart because of this issue, and they don't want to. So they come up with their own ideology. They're fighting with compact theory that Jefferson started, and then they decide to add to this a new theory of popular sovereignty. Give the peoples what they want. If a new territory is deciding to become a state, let them vote via popular sovereignty if they want to be free, if they want to be slave. This is going to save our party. It brings bleeding Kansas. It's a terrible idea. It causes a man named Stephen Douglas, who desperately wants to be president, the little giant, by the way. He's the one that starts popular sovereignty. He creates the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and thereby we get bleeding Kansas. He ain't never going to be president of the United States. And then the Civil War comes, and now we have some real problems because our Southern Democratic friends join the Confederacy. Northern Democrats who support the Union became known as War Democrats. So you have a split now within the Democratic Party. There's also Northern Democrats, and I emphasize this, Northern Democrats who sympathize with the South. Abraham Lincoln called them Copperheads, and a lot of them went to jail without habeas corpus, without getting read any rights. So the war comes, the war goes, the Democratic Party suffers. For Republicans, it became easy to win elections early on. They had a little thing called waving the bloody shirt. No, that's the party at the Jersey Shore. I'm sorry. Waving the bloody shirt. You have a shirt that has maybe some blood on it or just this symbolized idea, and you got people realizing the Republican Party saved the Union, Democrats try to destroy the Union. Hey, vote where the shirt is waving, the Republican side. And so that helped Republicans win elections for several decades. Eventually, a Democrat from Buffalo, Cleveland. Look what I just said. I'm trying to talk so fast, I'm not making any sense. From Buffalo, New York, Grover Cleveland, rises pretty quickly. Mayor of Buffalo to governor of New York to president of the United States. He's a Democrat. Yes, a Democrat who finally breaks in there, but he decides to go back to that classical liberalism, the idea of the contract of the people and the government, the idea of small government, laissez-faire economics. He's the president that famously says, people support the government. The government does not support the people. Pass me a ham sandwich. All right, so that's Grover Cleveland. And you might remember also, he was a bachelor as he was running for president, and it turns out he starts to date and court a 21-year-old girl. Good for him. Awesome. Not really sure what that means. But it doesn't last long. He wins an election. He loses an election. The Republicans buy him out pretty easily in the election of 1888 with Benjamin Harrison. So small we can't even see him. And then Cleveland comes back again in 92. And then we have a horrible panic in 93. Finally, the Democrats get settled with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, because of progressivism, decides to marry the Democratic Party to liberal progressivism forever. And eventually this will just grow within the Democratic Party. You get FDR's New Deal. You get LBJ's, not LeBron James, but Lyndon Baines Johnson. his Great Society, just all these progressive measures. Even today with Barack Obama and his Affordable Health Care Act, a lot of progressivism. Although it dies out quite a bit in the 70s and 80s, it's always going to kind of be there for the Democratic Party. Well, let's look again about what was going on now in the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson has 2 terms in office, and his progressivism, he fights a war through his progressive means. And the Republicans eventually get tired of that, and they have the 1920s is their decade. A return to normalcy. A made-up word, if it was ever a made-up word. And we get Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Just keep cool with Coolidge. And eventually, that great American, Herbert Hoover. And of course, the stock market crashes. And no one wants to return to normalcy anymore. And so the Democrats come back in the 1930s with FDR and the New Deal. And you get Truman takes over with the Fair Deal. Now, Truman has one of these interesting elections. Remember, he took over Roosevelt, FDR, won not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4. Man, that sounds like LeBron James all of a sudden. But he won 4 elections. Yes, 4 elections. Of course, FDR dies shortly into his 4th term. He won the 44 election, and that's when Truman took over. Truman only wins the 48 election. And it's an interesting election. The Democratic Party gets torn apart over this issue of segregation. And a faction within the Democrats rise called the Dixiecrats. They want to keep segregation. They want to preach states' rights. They do not like the fact that Truman has talked about integrating the Army and making it fair policy for anyone to have a federal job. And Truman should have lost this election. Everyone thought he was going to lose it. In fact, the Chicago Tribune prints, Dewey beats Truman. Dewey was the Republican challenger, and that's Truman actually holding up the paper because Truman won the election of 48. And then the Cold War happens, and it becomes miserable for everybody. China falls to the communists, and of course the Democrats get all the blame, and that's one of the reasons why Lyndon Johnson, a decade and a half later, gets involved in Vietnam, because he doesn't want to be the guy who allows Vietnam to fall the way China fell. What? Why do we think this? I don't know. All right. Eventually, a conservative movement will begin in the 60s, and by the 80s, it will enthrone Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. One of the things that Republicans begin to realize is they got to get white Southern men to vote for them who predominantly vote Democrat. So they come up with a Southern strategy. Whenever you hear great expressions like law and order president, I'm going to be tough on crime. This is code for, hey, we don't like segregation stuff either, and we can do things like make it harder for this, that. It's racism. Let's just put it out there. It's racism. And it helped some Republicans like Nixon and then Ronald Reagan win presidencies. But of course, the Cold War is always there. Under Nixon, we got détente. Détente falls apart with Carter, and then Reagan decides to spend the Soviets into the ground. The moral majority, this is this religious revival, the Fourth Great Awakening, individuals that helped, again, during the conservative movement, and they helped Reagan win the election of 1980. And that's it, and we'll see you guys later.